Hello, in this video, I'm going to be talking specifically about the history of drug use in the United States. So I'm going to be going over some of the major trends in the ways that drugs have typically been used throughout US history, including pre-Columbian history, the development of patent medicines, the Civil War, the 1960s and their drug culture, and then the development of club drugs and then synthetic drugs. So pre-Columbian history, or history in the US before it was its own country and before there was really trade with Europe. We know that nicotine was commonly in use. There were a lot of tobacco fields throughout pre-Columbian United States. And people would grow tobacco and they would either smoke it or they would chew it, as they do today. We also know that peyote, which is a cactus-based drug that causes altered mindsets and hallucinations, was often used in religious ceremonies. It could also be either chewed or smoked, and it was used basically at times when people would gather and people would specifically chew the peyote in order to enter that altered mindset. We also know that both drugs were not part of European culture and were not commonly used in Europe until the trades opened up between Europe and North America, and we begin to see nicotine especially take off in Europe to the point where tobacco becomes one of the most important crops grown in North America. We also see that Europeans introduced North America to alcohol and to opium because they brought that over when they began to trade with North America in the 1500s. Moving forward to about the 1800s, we begin to see the development of patent medicines. So these were in some ways the first over-the-counter drugs available in the United States. And they were oftentimes marketed as cure-alls, good for what ails you. Or the idea behind patent medicines was if there was anything wrong with you, you could take wizard oil, snake oil, magic oil, and you generally didn't know what that oil contained, although it was oftentimes some kind of opiate and some kind of stimulant, such as cocaine, and it would make you feel better, in essence. So many of these patent medicines contain active ingredients that had severe side effects and or the potential for addiction. Many of them contained alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, or other marijuana derivatives, and eventually many of them came to contain heroin. So for a lot of people, they would begin taking these drugs, would not realize that the drugs themselves could be addictive, and would only realize that, maybe I felt ill. I took this drug containing a lot of cocaine and heroin for a long time. And as soon as I stopped taking the drug, I began to feel ill. So it must be that this patent medicine is staving off this illness, and I need to just keep taking this patent medicine no matter what. There was not really a widespread awareness of addiction, including physical addiction and psychological addiction, and there was relatively little awareness of the negative side effects of these particular medicines. They were also, as I've said, completely unregulated, where there was no requirement that the patent medicines be accurately labeled with the amount or strength of their ingredients. And therefore, a lot of the time, people did not really know what they were buying or know what they were consuming and had no way to find out. However, we begin to see a shift towards awareness of addiction with the American Civil War. So the American Civil War led to widespread opiate addiction and what was known as the soldier's disease, which was addiction to heroin, opium, and or morphine. So we know the reason that opioid addiction was so widespread following the Civil War is that morphine was widely used. So individuals who were injured during battle would be given morphine, oftentimes continuously for weeks on end, which could lead to physical dependency. And we also know that psychological dependency was fairly common among soldiers who were coping with PTSD, chronic pain from various injuries, depression, and other negative consequences of having been at battle. And therefore, many of them were unfortunately dealing with addiction to especially heroin. And so, following the Civil War and following the growth of the soldier's disease, we do actually see a beginning of a growth of awareness about addiction and about the dangers of long-term opiate use on the body and on basically the growing physical dependence it creates following the Civil War. Fast forward another century, and we see that recreational drug use in the United States explodes in the 1960s. Drugs such as LSD, such as cocaine, heroin, marijuana, all became more widespread, easier to grow, synthesize, and access, and cheaper to purchase, especially in a relatively pure form or a form without additives, for the first time in large areas of the United States. So all of these recreational drugs that we begin to see come into use in the 1960s, again, LSD, cocaine, amphetamines, most of them had been around before the 1960s, but most of the time people didn't necessarily know about them, didn't necessarily use them recreationally, or simply weren't able to purchase them in a sufficient quantity to achieve a high. Before the 1960s, there were several different cultural movements that led to a growing popularity of all of these different substances in the 1960s, especially around hippie culture. So in the 1960s, we begin to see an awareness of not just the danger of addiction, but also the danger of a bad trip. So a bad trip is an experience of basically frightening and basically mood altering hallucinations. And these can actually be incredibly traumatizing. They can lead to nightmares and flashbacks among people who experience some of the worst effects of LSD and other hallucinogens. We also see that in the 1960s, there is a growth of, in essence, new ways to get high, or we see that new substances begin to be used as drugs. So for a long time, airplane glue, which was a glue that was sold with basically model airplanes, contained a compound that when inhaled would produce a high feeling, or again, an elevated mood state and mild hallucinations. People would use that substance, would deliberately sniff the glue in order to experience the mood changes and hallucinations. Unfortunately, that led to several fatalities and led the manufacturers of the model airplanes to change the formula of the glue. But we also saw the growth of many other forms of inhaling various substances, from gasoline to other forms of superglue, in order to try and achieve a high. If we fast forward to the 1990s, that's when we begin to see the growth of club drugs. So club drugs are generally drugs that produce hallucinations and elevated mood and elevated energy levels. And they were consumed in nightclubs, hence the name, in generally raves or other very long parties, with the goal being that they gave the person the energy to party all night. So some of the most popular club drugs that came into use in the late 1980s throughout the 1990s, GHB, ecstasy or methylenedioxymethamphetamine, methamphetamine, so that's not basically artificial amphetamine, and Rohypnol. So the major danger associated with the use of club drugs is their use as date rape drugs. So date rape drugs are drugs that are given to a friend or an acquaintance or a date at a party in order to make the person unable to resist sexual assault, in the case of GHB, which induces relaxation, or sometimes unable to remember sexual assault, as is the case with Rohypnol or a roofie, which causes the person to have greater difficulty forming memories and causes their memories to become disjointed. So what will happen with a lot of these drugs is a rapist will place them in someone's drink, make the person, for instance, uncoordinated or disoriented, will then basically guide the person away from the party into a private area and will sexually assault them. And the other major danger to the user of club drugs is that most of them are very dangerous when combined with alcohol. So, for instance, ecstasy produces a state of dehydration. It leads to a drying out of the mouth and it causes excessive sweating. So, when combined with alcohol, which has the subjective mouth feeling of being hydrating, but also leads to dehydration, so it makes it harder to detect that you are dehydrated while also dehydrating you, unfortunately leads to deaths of dehydration and heat stroke every year. So ecstasy and alcohol are specifically dangerous in combination with one another. And then we also see the growth in the mid-noughts, so about 2000 to about 2010, of synthetic drugs. So synthetic drugs are drugs that are created in labs to specifically mimic the effects of known drugs that are illegal, while in essence trying to get around drug laws. So if there is no law against using a particular plant and a particular oil in combination to mimic the effects of an illegal substance, then the individual can, in essence, sell a legal high, at least for a time, until the drug laws change, and then the drugs themselves change, and there's sort of this ongoing race around synthetic drugs. So one of the most dangerous synthetic drugs that was kind of first came into awareness around 2010 to 2012 is fentanyl. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. So it mimics the action of an opiate, such as heroin or morphine, but it is made of a completely different chemical structure. And it has, in essence, been purified down to the point where only a few grains of fentanyl. So if you picture just a few, 2 or 3 grains of salt, that's all that fentanyl that you need in order to experience a high feeling. However, fentanyl is also extremely dangerous for that exact reason, because if 2 or 3 grains is all it takes to experience a high feeling, then 10 grains is all you need in order to experience a fatal overdose. So fentanyl is an extremely dangerous drug. It's oftentimes one that people who have become addicted to opioids turn to out of desperation. Most of the time they're aware of the risks, but are unable to stop using opioids and unable to find alternatives that they can afford. Fentanyl, interestingly, is actually under consideration for being the new drug to use in lethal injections in the United States, where there's an ongoing debate about the drug that induces death the most quickly and painlessly of all the options we have available. And it appears that fentanyl might be the option that produces death most quickly, painlessly, and reliably of the known drugs in the United States now. So it's not clear yet whether it will be used in lethal injections in the future, but it is under consideration because it is that dangerous and that lethal to use. Bath salts are less dangerous than fentanyl. They are designed to be sort of like an amphetamine or a methamphetamine, and bath salts are basically crystallized drugs that produce hallucinations and sort of an altered state of consciousness, somewhat similar to ecstasy. And they are specifically designed to be difficult to detect and easy to transport, where they are colorless, odorless little rocks. So they look like a bath salt. That's where the name came from. And they are used in a lot of the time in club drugs and in club drug settings. And again, there was sort of a gap in the laws between when they were developed and when they were outlawed, during which there were unfortunately some overdose deaths. And then synthetic marijuana has largely fallen out of popularity as real marijuana has become more legal and more decriminalized. But synthetic marijuana is a plant compound that is soaked in basically an industrial solvent. So a chemical used to dissolve oils and basically, caked on residue. And when combined, these two produce basically a leaf-like substance similar to marijuana that can then be eaten or smoked. As with bath salts, they are oftentimes more dangerous than the drug they are meant to mimic, because they are artificial. And again, were really only developed to try and get around drug laws, because for a time after their development, they were technically legal to use. So next video, I am going to be talking about some of the drug laws that have caused the development of some of these synthetic drugs.